We are just like going to discuss about the cervical segment of the sympathetic chain and the ganglion which is related to it. Sometimes we see that some small questions related to the ganglions which is prevailing in the cervical region, like in the neck region, is coming as a short note. And of course, this is of clinical importance. That's why we just like discuss about it. But to go into this particular cervical ganglia, before that we have to have a brush up of little bit of this particular sympathetic chain system that we already have learned. So this is what we are familiar with. We have done these dissections in the thoracic region. We have seen this chain which is persist in the sides of the vertebra. We call them as paravertebral sympathetic chain, and it has a nodular structures which are known as ganglions. So these are known as the sympathetic ganglions, and this particular thing which is hanging or joining them, we call them as sympathetic chain. Now this particular sympathetic ganglions, we understand these are collections of neuronal cell bodies, and these particular channels which is joining between them, these are known as tracts, which is basically containing the fibers which are coming from these particular ganglions. So if you just like see that in total this particular sympathetic chain exists from this occipital region or the in this particular region, base of the skull. From that region to this particular coccyx or coccygeal region, right side and the left side, they are prevailing in, and eventually they join at the bottom at the coccygeal region, making a final ganglia. We call them as ganglionic impart. But this is the outlook. But before that, we have to understand where from these things are coming. Now we are familiar with the cross sections of the spinal cord. Now the spinal cord can be divided of two contents there. We call them as gray matter and white matter. Now this gray matter, which looks like H, it has two horns which is known as anterior horn and posterior horn. So anterior horn, posterior horn is familiar with us, holding this particular cell bodies of these motor cells and the sensory cells. In addition to that, in some segments of the spinal cord, which is in the thoracic region and the lumbar region, has additional projections. We call them as lateral horn. So this lateral horn is present, I repeat again, in the thoracic region and the lumbar region spinal cord segment. Now this particular lateral horn is the house of the cell bodies of these sympathetic nerves. So this sympathetic nerve cell bodies starts from this lateral horn of these particular thoracolumbar segments and travel around this, goes to these particular channels and gets into this particular tract and ends into the ganglion. So then we call this particular neuron which is starting in here, we call them as pre-ganglionic sympathetic neuron. Then we have the second order neuron starts from this particular ganglion. We call them as post-ganglionic neuron fibers. So we get this particular two words together, pre-ganglionic nerve cells and pre-ganglionic nerve fibers, which is sympathetic of course, and this post-ganglionic nerve cells and post-ganglionic nerve fibers. These are the two things that we have to understand a little bit. Now then we have to understand about little bit about this particular tracts. As you can see, this particular pre-ganglionic fiber catching up this particular ventral rami and getting into this particular tracts. Before it gets into the tract, it takes a kind of roundabout. Now this particular roundabout which you're seeing here and this particular region, we call this as white Rami Communicantes or white communications of these sympathetic fibers. This one, which is the red one with continuous line which is going like. So this particular pre-ganglionic nerve fiber going like here from this particular part, taking a wing over here and then it's going on. This particular tract from here to here, we call them as white Rami Communicantes. Similar to that, it goes and climbs up and ends here in the ganglion. From the ganglion, you see that there's a second order neuron starts here. We call them as already, we know that is called them as post-ganglionic nerve fiber. So post-ganglionic sympathetic nerve fiber takes another route, this one, which is arrow over here. This tract we call them as gray Rami Communicantes. So these two, white Rami communication or white Rami Communicantes and gray Rami Communicantes, will be surfacing again and again when we are going to talk about. So you should have a visual idea about what do you mean by this gray Rami Communicantes and white Rami Communicantes, because these things will be mattering to understand. If you do not try to understand, just let go. So once again, so you get this particular sympathetic chain which is having a ganglion and a tract which is joining between this ganglion. We call them as sympathetic chain, which is between them. We call them a sympathetic trunk. Together, this particular ganglion and this particular tract make this particular trunk. Right side and left side exist. So sympathetic nerve fibers coming over here and ending to or going to the end organs through this particular fiber channel system. That's what we are going to see. So this what is present in entire system, starting from the base of the skull to this particular coccyx region. Now our point of discussion here today, we are just going to talk about this particular chain system or this ganglion in the neck region. We call them a cervical segment. That's what we are going to focus. So coming back again, we have this particular sympathetic chain which is constituting of this ganglion and this particular tracts which contains the fibers of preganglionic, post-ganglionic fibers coming from the spinal cord and going somewhere where what we are going to see. So this particular thing in this particular cervical segment we are going to see. Now this is what we talked about. We have a constituting element, we call them as ganglion. What do you mean by the ganglion? The collections of the multipolar ganglion neuron cell bodies which is present within this particular outside of this particular chain system, outside of the central nervous system within this chain. So this particular ganglion is a cell body which is present and it contains this trunk which is sympathetic trunks which is joining this ganglion there, which contains the fibers which is coming from either preganglionic or post-ganglionic fiber, and they together makes this particular chain. We call them a sympathetic trunk. Right side and left side, they are existing throughout this particular system or the body. In this particular ganglion, if you are going to count these numbers of the ganglion, they should be similar or identical to the same number of spinal nerves. So much spinal nerves we have, the number, this ganglion should correspond with that. In this particular region of this particular thoracic region and the lumbar region as well, we see the number of ganglia pretty much same, like 11 pairs, 4 pairs, and the sacral region is 4 pairs. Corresponds more or less the same number of this particular spinal nerve that is present in this region. Whereas it differs in the neck region. In the neck region, we see that there's only 3 cervical ganglion are there. Why this cervical ganglion are there? 3 in the thoracic region, because they become fused, and because they are fused little bit atypical than the rest of them, they are of point of interest. They are exam questions for us. So these 3 cervical ganglia that is present in the neck region, that's what we are going to study. So how these particular ganglions are formed and where they are located, that we are starting with. The sympathetic chain in the cervical part is present between this particular content. We have to dig through this particular neck region. In this thoracic in this region, we have the anterior triangle. In the anterior triangle, we have this carotid triangle. If you get this carotid triangle as a content of it, is this particular carotid sheath with this content. If you go deep to this posterior layer of carotid sheath, you find this particular carotid sympathetic chain which is placed inside. So it is present behind this carotid sheath and it is lying on top of the muscle on the neck region. We call them as longus muscle. Longus capitis, longus colli. These are the neck muscle that is present in here. So it is lying between this carotid sheath and this particular or posterior layer of carotid sheath to be specific, and the longus colli. Now coming to the numbers of them, this particular thing should be have 8 numbers but becomes fused to get these 3 of them. We call them as superior cervical ganglion, middle cervical ganglion, and inferior cervical ganglion. Superior cervical ganglion is fused by formations of upper 4 cervical ganglion, 1, 2, 3, 4 number like this, fused to form 1 superior cervical ganglion. Next is the middle one, number 5 and number 6 fused to form the middle cervical ganglia, and the inferior one is formed by the fusions of 7th and 10th cervical ganglion. These are the total number of the sympathetic ganglion that is present. Out there, superior and middle could be small questions or short questions that is given to it. We'll talk about this each of them individually. So let's take about this particular cervical ganglia. As I mentioned, number of them, 3 of them. How to call them as superior, middle, and inferior cervical ganglia. To understand what you mean by the ganglia is collections of the neuronal cell body. What kind of cells it is there? Sympathetic cells which is present inside to it, which is having this particular tenure coming from this particular preganglionic fiber ending in there, forming to the postganglionic fibers. So this particular cervical ganglia is there. We take this particular superior one first, and then we talk about the inferior one, and then we talk about the middle one afterwards. So superior cervical ganglion, which is a fusion of the three, largest of all, that is present in between this location over here, is lying between this particular vertebral border, or vertebra corresponds to C2 C3 cervical vertebra. So this particular locations over here is roughly in the high up in the neck region it is present, and this particular regions over this particular element is present between this particular carotid artery and the longus scoli muscle, which is present on the posterior side of it. So superior cervical ganglion, which is present in the topmost fusion of the four cervical vertebrae, ganglions, they are present in this region. Now, once these particular ganglions are formed, the post-ganglionic fibers are coming. So post-ganglionic fibers, they are coming from this region and going to give some branches. We call these branches as lateral branches and medial branches. These lateral branches, we call them as Rami Communicantes. We understand this Rami Communicantes, these branches, which is Rami Communicantes, climbs this particular spinal nerves, like which is nearby to it, and follow the spinal nerves as it going on. So this lateral branch, which is coming from the cervical ganglia, we call them as Rami Communicantes branch, which is going in along with the spinal nerves. Coming to the medial branches, the medial branches can be called as cardiac branch, medial branch proper, or the vascular branches. So cardiac branch, that means a superior cervical ganglia sends a branch which is going down to form a nerve. We call them a superior cardiac nerve. That is going to form a plexus. We call them as superior or inferior or middle or cardiac plexus, which is present in the thoracic region. We call them as cardiac plexus. So this particular cardiac branch, which is coming from the superior cervical ganglia, go to serve to form a ganglion or go to form a particular plexus around, which is going to supply the heart eventually. Then we have these other branches, medial branches, so which is coming like a spider webs and catching up this particular internal carotid artery or branches of it. So this climbs on the internal carotid artery and the further this particular sub branches of this internal carotid artery, like a carotidotympanic branches, petrosal branches, etc., etc. So they climb this particular vascular artery and they travel along this whatever these arteries are going. So as these arteries are growing, the branches from the superior cervical ganglions are going on and supplying these particular end organs. So what we are getting out here from these particular ganglions, we have the branches, we call them as lateral branches that catches this particular spinal nerves. This branch has a special name, we call them as Rami Communicantes, and medial branch, which is dedicated to heart, we call them as cardiac branch, and other branches catches up this particular blood vessels which is nearby. We have this internal carotid, common carotid, and the sub branches of them, and they travel around these particular arteries, ramifying in it and going to sub these particular organs which is present in it. Similar to this particular superior ganglion, we have another ganglion deep or under to it, we call them as middle cervical ganglion, which is present in the midway between this particular vertebra border C5, C6, around that particular region. So half or middle portions of the neck region, C4, C5 region, you find another ganglia which is present. Where this particular ganglion is present, again between the vessels, which is common carotid artery, which is lying in front, and loop of this particular internal inferior thyroid artery, which is climbing up. So between them and posterior to that, we have the same longus scoli muscle. Between them, this particular middle cervical ganglion is there. So this particular middle cervical ganglions is giving the same thing. It has branches going to supply some organs. What is going here? From this particular middle cervical ganglia, it gives some lateral branches. The lateral branches, we call them as Rami Communicantes. What they do? They climb up along these particular spinal nerves, C6, C5, and travel along the spinal nerves. They give some medial branches. The medial branches, we call them as cardiac branch, which is dedicated to the heart. And along with that, they give the vascular branches. They catch up these particular blood vessels, which is nearby. Here we have this common carotid artery and travel along. So this is about the middle cervical ganglion, which is present. Coming to the third one, inferior cervical ganglion, which is formed by the fusions of the lowest two ganglions, C7 and C8 region. This particular ganglion is present at the bottom or root of the neck where it is present. Between these particular arteries, which is, you see that locations over here nearly at this particular opening over here. This opening which is present in here, we call them as thoracic outlet, also known as thoracic aperture, which is present on the upper part we call them a superior thoracic aperture. So nearby in this particular root of the neck, this inferior cervical ganglion is there. Sometimes we see that this inferior cervical ganglia may be fused with this thoracic ganglion, which forms this particular union. Such kind of union, we give a special name to it, we call them a stellate ganglion. But anyways, the inferior cervical ganglia, which is present in here, related to this particular vertebral vessels anteriorly, and this particular thoracic duct, which is present on the side of it, and posteriorly it is related to this longus colli muscle. So between these vessels and these muscles, these are present in this particular region. The location over here in this root of the neck region. Same thing, branches from here. There are branches, we call them as lateral branches. Lateral branches, we call them as Rami Communicantes. What do? They climb up along with this particular spinal nerves, and as the spinal nerve goes to supply, it supplies. There are another branch, we call them as medial branches, which is known as cardiac dedicated branch and vascular branches. The branch of these vascular arteries or vascular branches which gets artery over here, we have the subclavian artery and the vertebral artery. They catch up this particular vertebral artery and the subclavian artery, ramify around, and as they move around, they go to supply to it. So this is the cervical ganglion, which is related to this particular neck region, that what we have to keep and understand over this content. So we have to start again, once again, to briefly talk about, this is what we understand. This is spinal cord cross section, lateral horn, which is a house of the sympathetic nerves, first order. Then we have the second order. This is, we call them as ganglion, sympathetic ganglion, which is joining over here, we call them as sympathetic trunk. The sympathetic trunk contains the fibers pre-ganglionic and post-ganglionic. And this particular ganglion is the cell body of these particular cells. We call them as post-ganglionic neuronal cells, sympathetic cells, which is there. Now, point of concern here, we have these tracts named like this. We call them as white Rami Communicantes and grey Rami Communicantes. This one, we call them as white Rami, and with the arrow, we call them as grey Rami Communicantes. The difference between them, you see that this is the pre-ganglionic fiber traveling over here with the white Rami Communicantes, whereas this grey Rami Communicantes contains this particular second order neuron. We call them as post-ganglionic fiber. So what do? They go and supply the organs as it related to this particular sympathetic or parasympathetic content structure is there. So in the neck region, we have these three of the ganglion, superior, middle and inferior. Superior, the largest of one. How this is formed is fusions of this particular ganglion, C1, C2, C3, C4, upper four, located between these particular arteries in the front, internal carotid, and the longest cavities in the back side. High up in the neck region, they are present. The branches which is coming from, we call them as lateral branch, go along the spinal nerve, we call them as grey Rami Communicantes branch. Medial branch, dedicated branch, cardiac branch. Other than this, these branches catches up the artery. We call them as vascular branches. Nearby, whatever this particular artery it gets, it climbs up along with the arteries. We call this as a branches. It's carrying through internal carotid branch, external carotid branch, common carotid branch, or sub branches like just like a petrosal branch, communicating branch, etc., etc. So these are the branches which is coming from the superior cervical ganglia. Middle one, the same story. Fusions of this particular C5, C6 cervical ganglia, cervical segment ganglia. This is present in the middle part of the neck between this particular common carotid artery and the muscle in the back. Branches coming from here. This is the same. Lateral branches, grey Rami Communicantes. What do? They go supply this particular spinal nerves. Medial branch, dedicated branch to the heart, we call them as cardiac branches. And vascular branches catches up this artery which gets it nearby. Here we get this particular branches like thyroid artery and the internal carotid or common carotid branches. Inferior cervical ganglia, which is present in the root of the neck region. This is very common for the clinician to target for the clinical part. We'll talk about later on in higher classes about this inferior cervical ganglia. Sometimes we see that inferior cervical ganglia may be fused with this first thoracic cervical vertebra. Then we call this as a cervicothoracic ganglion or stellate ganglion. The stellate ganglion comes as a short note sometimes or an MCQ about this content. So where this particular content is present is the root of this particular neck region between this particular artery, which is like climbing fiber of the internal thoracic artery, and this particular region we have this particular subclavian artery as well in the front, and this particular thoracic duct present. Posteriorly we have the muscle, longus colli muscle. Now branches, the same thing. Lateral branches, Rami Communicantes follows these spinal nerves. Medial branch, dedicated cardiac branch, and vascular branch catches up this artery, which is subclavian artery, and the vertebral artery, which is present to it. So this is about this things which is related to this cervical ganglion, superior, middle, and inferior. Maybe individually given as a short note, or maybe a whole thing may be coming as a short note. Clinical problem related to the Horner syndrome, Raynaud's disease, angina pectoralis will be covered in the content. I believe it is already covered, the Horner syndrome, which is important for us for in the ophthalmology sessions. It is covered. So I'm not just like spending time on it. So this is, you prepare this particular thing for the exam short note. Thank you.